Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Borths, and I'm the head of the directing staff at Des Moines Metro Opera, stage directing staff. And I'm joining you here from Capital University in Columbus, Ohio, where I'm the director of opera musical theater and professor of music history. And I am so excited to be talking to you today about our final opera, Le Comte Ory, from our 2020 virtual festival. I cannot believe we're at the end of this month-long journey in the midst of a strange summer. It has been a joy to speak with all of you and to explore these wonderful operas from previous seasons at Des Moines Metro Opera. As we look forward to Le Comte Ory, it's worth thinking about the legacy of its composer, Rossini. And when I think of the most ridiculous moments in all of opera, whether it's the use of Rossini's music in Bugs Bunny cartoons, the shaving scene from The Barber of Seville, the slightly lesser known pasta throwing scene in Italian Girl in Algiers, or this afternoon's nuns men disguised as nuns who find the wine keg. This is yet another example of Rossini's crazy sense of humor and manicness, which comes through in really, really beautiful ways. This is a fun evening. This is a fun afternoon of opera. You may not have your life changed by this music, but we hope that you are thoroughly delighted. And that's exactly what Rossini would have wanted, and is a common theme throughout his work, pushing the comic nature, the wit, the joy that he was expressing on stage out to the audience. So let's go ahead and get started with talking about the opera itself. This is an opera that maybe many of you are not familiar with. Maybe you saw a recent Met production of this, which was done for the first time just a couple of years ago by them, or at Des Moines Metro Opera, maybe you saw this production live. But for many of you, this is probably the first time seeing this piece. So let's talk a little bit about what this piece is. So we're going to go ahead and go to a slide right now. Le Comte Ory translates, it's a French title, to the Count Ory. This is a famous Don Juan character, not unlike Don Giovanni, same kind of legends, a famous philanderer. And this opera premiered towards the end of Rossini's career, not the end of his life, but the end of his career. And we'll talk about that distinction in just a few moments. And was largely using music that existed from a previous opera called Il Viaggio a Rome. This opera, Il Viaggio a Rome, was written to celebrate the coronation of Charles X when the monarchy, there was a turnover, one of the many turnovers in French politics. And so Rossini wrote this opera in commemoration for the coronation of Charles X. But that opera was very specific to its own time and place. And so there was all this great music, all this virtuosic singing, but no one really knew the work. And so he took a lot of this music and he put it into Le Comte Ory. This recycling of pre-existing music was a hallmark of not just Rossini, but the bel canto composers at large in the first half of the 19th century. When we look at this tradition of taking music from a previous opera that maybe wasn't successful or was very specific to its time and place, like Viaggio a Rome, we, with our 21st century sensibility, may say that's cheating. The thing to remember is that during this period, there was no such thing as Italian copyright, at least not widely used. And so composers only got money at premieres of works. So the quicker you could churn out material, the more money you got. Secondly, we're in a world that didn't have recordings. So if you were not there in the theater to hear this music, you did not experience it, which meant that music from other operas could be used and fit different settings as we move forward. So Rossini had all of this great music and put it into this French opera. The libretto, or the text, the story that they found for this music was by two great French playwrights. Eugene Scribe, in fact, was one of the most popular and eternal of the French grand opera librettists. So this is quite a literary pedigree. And these two Frenchmen wrote a comedy in 1817 called Le Comte Ory, and tells the story of our philandering Don Juan, the Count Ory, in the year 1200. Now, that medieval setting is not particularly relevant to this story. This is not, a medieval miracle play or anything like that. But it does give us a great plot point, and that is that all of the men of the castle of the Countess Adele are off on crusades. So we have this wonderful setup where all of the men are away and the Countess is left alone. And the Count Ory wants to seduce the Countess. And so he goes through a number of different guises and disguises in order to get into the castle. At the beginning of the work, he disguises as a wise hermit. And so he's able to get into the castle. And then in Act Two, he disguises with a bunch of his henchmen as pilgrims, as nuns, who then find the liquor cabinet or the liquor cellar at the bottom of the castle and have a grand old time. And so this medieval setting allows for this wonderful comic situation to arise. Now, there is a third character in addition to the Countess Adele, who the Count Ory is hoping to seduce, and that is his page, who is a pants role. This means that it's a mezzo-soprano, so a woman, playing the role of a man. And throughout this opera, you will see a love triangle start to develop. And this entire opera culminates in a great trio where all three of them find themselves in the bedroom of the Countess. There is a lot of disguising of gender, disguising of identity, and creates one of the most effervescent trios, really, in all of opera. It is a stunning, hilarious, sensual moment towards the end of this production. It premiered at the Paris Opera, so in the kind of grandest of the Parisian theaters, right when Rossini was at the height of his fame. If you asked someone living in the 1820s who was the most famous composer of Europe, they would not necessarily have said Beethoven. They probably would have said Rossini. He was ubiquitous with European music at this time, and the Parisians were especially taken by his music. This caused a lot of Parisian critics, people like Hector Berlioz, to say, whoa, there is too much Italian music, too much Italian influence on our stages. But Comte Ory is this great example of the Italian and French traditions coming together, beginning to merge, that would eventually lead to pieces like Manon, which we saw at the beginning of this virtual festival. This coming together of the light, effervescent vocal quality of the Italian music with the theatricality and the conventions of the French. Le Comte Ory is really this a genre unto its own. It reminds me in many ways of one of my favorite Rossini quotes, which means all genres are good except those that are boring. And so while this opera defies a lot of nationalistic conventions, it manages to be a wonderful gem combining both the Italian and French influences. This was ultimately Rossini's penultimate opera, second to last opera, and was followed by the famous William Tell, which ushered in the era of the French Grand Opera right before Rossini mysteriously ended his career. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the thing to understand about Le Comte Ory is while its genre is really specific unto itself, it comes to us from the world of the bel canto. Bel canto literally means beautiful singing. And this was a style of opera that dominated from about the year 1800 to about the year 1850, as Verdi started to write his great masterpieces Rigoletto and La Traviata. This style shifted. So for about the first half of the 1800s, bel canto opera was all the rage. And for many opera lovers, bel canto opera, the operas of Rossini, the operas of Donizetti and of Bellini, represent the pinnacle of opera-ness, if you will. And yet, if you asked an Italian what they thought of their art at the time, they would have said that it was in crisis. I want to show you a map. This is a map of Italy, or of Europe, I should say, in 1815, right at the end of the Napoleonic age. And notice there in the Italian peninsula, all of those different regions that you see are not just different states. Those are different political entities. Not a lot of people realize it, especially in the United States, but Italy was not politically unified until the 1860s. That means that Rossini's life was almost at an end when this unification finally happened. And so, for much of Italian history, and almost all of the 19th century Italian history, Italy was a cultural idea. It was a linguistic region. And music and opera was one of the best ways to assert Italianness. And particularly as German music was on the rise, people like Mozart, for example, Beethoven, the Italians realized that they were losing control of the art form they had created. The Italians were great innovators in creating opera, creating symphonies, creating tonality in many ways. And so they found themselves kind of on the back foot. They found themselves a little bit in the backwater in the early 1800s. And so what they did was they put their foot down and created this bel canto style. Let's go to our next slide and talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about bel canto style. First of all, it's both a style of opera and a style of singing. So almost every opera that you'll hear at the Met or Des Moines Metro Opera is sung in the bel canto style. But it's also this Italian period from 1800 to 1850 as the Italians were asserting their Italianness in the midst of this politically tumultuous time, as the control of the Italian peninsula itself was under threat. That's very important to keep in mind. This was a tumultuous century. Politics was very much on the forefront of everyone's mind. Whether Italy should exist politically was on the forefront of everyone's mind, and bel canto opera was a way to assert that cultural identity. This style of opera is characterized by being intensely singer-based. This is all about showing off the voice. This afternoon, you are going to be treated to some incredible bel canto singing. So the orchestra is there to support the singer. You'll notice that the orchestration, or what is coming out of the orchestra pit, is a lot of just accompanying. All you'll hear is kind of bum 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 ba da 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 da, that kind of little repeating melody that simply provides the key for the singers to show you what they can do. That was very important. The vocal melody that the composer wrote, that Rossini wrote in this case, is vital to appreciating this style of opera. Even when instruments take over the melody or there is an orchestral moment, it still functions like a solo voice with an accompanying orchestra. So really think about this. Everything that you hear, everything that you see is about showing off the singer, with that orchestra supporting the beauty of the human voice. That is what Italian style is all about. Additionally, the bel canto opera is governed by a series of really complicated conventions. These were expectations that audiences had about what they would see when they went to the opera. Now, this could sound kind of academic. This can sound like you have to know a lot of different ideas before you can really appreciate this opera. And that's not exactly true, because our art form of today in the 21st century is filled with conventions as well. I like to use the example of Marvel movies. Whenever you go and you see a big Hollywood blockbuster superhero movie, there are certain things you expect to see. It's gonna start out with a chase scene, with kind of in the middle of the action, you see the hero. You're going to be confronted with a bad guy who's after some kind of magical object or magical device. There is going to be the triumph of good over evil. There will be some kind of love interest or humanizing relationship. And then at the end, you're going to have an epic battle that resolves the problems and the fate of the world. Those are all conventions. There is a contract when you go to a superhero movie of what you expect to see. And when the filmmakers change that up, let's say the movie begins with a really in-depth conversation about the meaning of life, then we, as the audience, are thrown for a loop and the convention is played with. That's exactly how these operas went. There was a contract between composer, singer, and audience about how these things go. So when you think about bel canto operas, think about these as summer blockbusters. Think about these as Hollywood movies, not so much operas in the way that we think of them in the 21st century. These operas came out all the time, constantly looking for the new best thing. The idea of repeating operas was not really something that was on the forefront of the Italian impresarios or producers. They were coming out with new content that really adhered to these audience expectations. Also, this music is ultimately abstract. What I mean by that is that the music that is written in these works is not necessarily specific to the characters at hand. Let me give you a great example from Rossini. We all know the famous opera of The Barber of Seville, maybe from Bugs Bunny, maybe from the opera itself, but the main melody, da 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 da, immediately calls to mind kind of sneaking around and clever hijinks. That overture was originally written for a much earlier serious opera by Rossini that was called Aureliano in Palmyra, the Roman Emperor Aurelius in Palmyra, in Syria. And it was originally meant to evoke the terror of the Assyrian people who were about to be conquered by the Romans. Da 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 da. So same music, but can be reinterpreted in a variety of different contexts. This music is abstract. It must be interpreted by the singer, by the production in that moment. That makes bel canto opera uh, always contemporaneous. It is always being reinterpreted freshly in front of you, and that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. And as I already mentioned, a lot of the music you'll hear this afternoon was recycled from previous operas, things like Il Viaggio a Rem. And then finally, these works, while most of these conventions were codified by Rossini himself, they are found in the works of Bellini and Donizetti as well. Let's go ahead and go to our next slide and talk a little bit about some of these conventions that you'll be listening for this afternoon. First of all, let's talk about the conventions of audience etiquette. I want you to put yourself in the mindset of audiences in the 19th century. This means that the house lights didn't really dim. There was no way to dim the house lights. And so you would attend the opera and you could see everyone in the audience. So if you keep up the lights in your living room, if you have lights streaming in, you're having fun, with those you're watching the opera with this afternoon, you are totally in the headspace of bel canto opera. Often meals would be served in boxes. Card games, poker games. Rossini actually made a lot of his money, not so much on the commissions of the operas themselves, but in splitting the proceeds of gambling rooms that would be happening in the lobby during the opera. So if you're playing a card game, if you're maybe playing a board game with friends while the opera is happening, that's a part of the environment. In fact, you'll see at the bottom, one of my favorite bel canto conventions is the sorbet aria. This is when, towards the end of the opera, a secondary character comes to the front of the stage and sings an aria. And you may be thinking, I don't care about that character. Why is this character singing? Well, the reason was because that was when you would pay up your bill. That was when the dessert would arrive and you would figure out where you were going to go next after the opera, finish up your game, enjoy your sorbet before turning your attention back to the stage for the opera. Always curtains were closing in these boxes, and salacious things that I won't mention would be happening during the opera. This is the world of the bel canto, having much more in common with our modern sports events or even kind of movie theater culture, if you will. Again, that Hollywood mindset of seeing, summer blockbuster was what this was actually like. Some things to pay attention for this afternoon. Audiences were always aware of genre, so there were different conventions of whether it was a comic work or a serious work. Comte Ory, as I mentioned, is very much a ridiculous comedy in the best way possible. So with that in mind comes a number of conventions. We will always start with an overture. We will then be introduced to some secondary characters in the chorus that are kind of set the stage, and then eventually we get the entrance arias of our main characters. These are called cavatinas, and these are all terms that audience members would have known. This process of overture, introduction of chorus and setting secondary characters into the introduction of the lead characters usually takes about 10 to 15 minutes, which if you've ever been to theaters in Italy, if you've ever had the opportunity to go, you will realize that's about how long it takes for the Italian audiences to actually get into this theater and to sit down. It was somewhat of a delaying tactic. Again, the social world of the bel canto is mixing with the musical structure that you hear and see before you. So keep that in mind as well. Every aria or solo song, but also duets and ensembles, tended to follow a three-part structure. So pay attention for and listen for this afternoon. It will almost always start with slow, lyrical, beautiful music. This is called the cantabile, which literally means lyric or song-like. Then something dramatic will happen. The sun will start to rise. A character will appear. The character has a realization, or a messenger arrives with a note. That is called the time in the middle, the tempo di mezzo, the time in the middle, where the whole thing shifts and we move into the cabaletta, and that is the fast, virtuosic, showy music. The term cabaletta derives from the same Italian word as a horse gallop. So if you think about kind of a horse galloping, that's how fast these notes are coming and how virtuosic this music is. So pay attention to this three-part structure. Every aria, you'll hear beautiful lyrical singing, but that will come to an end when something dramatic shifts and we move into the fast, thrilling music. That is the structure of almost everything in a bel canto opera. Towards the end of each act, you'll usually get some kind of concertati or concertato, and that is when the action comes to a standstill and everyone sings about what they're feeling. These are some of the best moments in all of opera, and is kind of the suspended moment of time before the action goes into its stunning, shocking, ridiculous conclusion, depending on what that opera might be. So all of these conventions audiences would have known and Rossini put into his operas, including Le Comte Ory. So with that mindset now in mind of what audiences felt like when they walked into the theater, about what Italy felt like as it was in the midst of all of this turmoil during the 19th century, let's now turn our attention to Rossini himself. He was born in 1792, as you see, and died in 1868. But if you remember our first slide about Le Comte Ory, you'll realize that I said that his last opera was written in 1829. So he lived for almost 40 years after he stopped writing operas. We'll talk about why in just a moment. Well, Rossini is most remembered by photographs. And at this next slide we'll go ahead and show you now is a photo of Rossini later on in his life. We tend to think about him as almost this Falstaff character, larger than life, witty, loved food, little overweight, lover of life. The way that I personally love to remember Rossini is our previous slide. Let's go back to that now. This is a sketch of the young Rossini. Since he stopped writing operas when he was 36, 37, what we're dealing with mostly when we're listening to Rossini's music is the music of a young, vibrant, energetic man. And so I like to think about him more in these terms than maybe the photos from later on in his life. Rossini was born in Pesaro to a musical family. His father was a singer. He was a instrumentalist as well. His mother was an actress and singer. And Rossini grew up mostly spending time with his mother, but also going on tours with the family as their theatrical and musical careers were developing. Interestingly enough, Rossini's father, Giuseppe, was a revolutionary and was actually imprisoned for a time for his pro-Italian unification politics. And so all the foreign occupiers and the various people who were taking over the Italian lands during Rossini's childhood imprisoned Giuseppe for his revolutionary tendencies. Because as a young boy, Rossini saw what that felt like, what that did to his family, it's interesting that as the 19th century developed, Rossini did not follow in his father's footsteps. He was not a big advocate for Italian nationalism, and he mostly kept out of the political spheres. He focused on art, he focused on his music, he focused on pasta, he focused on culture. And that was worth noting because many composers of his time were digging into politics, but because of the revolutionary tendencies in the jail time his father experienced, Rossini kept distance. At a very young age, he distinguished himself as a composer. He became very prominent very, very early, writing things like The Barber of Seville in his 20s. He had famous stints as an impresario or a theatrical producer, an artistic director in Naples. He premiered operas in Venice, in Milan. He was really all over, and he wrote these operas incredibly quickly. Again, he is a Hollywood producer churning out movie after movie after movie just in time for the blockbuster season, recycling music, delving into these conventions, adding his incredible melodies and ornaments to show off the beauty of the human voice. Eventually, his fame was so renowned that he was invited to Paris, where he was in charge of the Théâtre Italien, the Italian theater in Paris, and wrote Evacuarem, Comte Ory, and William Tell. I mentioned that he then retired at 36, 37, but lived for another 40 years. We're not really sure why this was, but there are a lot of theories. You know, this is obviously would have been a very personal decision for Rossini, so it's very, very complicated. But some of those contributing factors were his mental state. He was depressed for much of his adult life. Especially after the death of his mother, who he was very, very close to. For example, as a young boy, he was mostly with his mom while his father was off creating the Italian state while also continuing a performing career. So he had bouts of depression. He also saw the changing political and cultural times. Charles X, the monarch in France, who he wrote Il Vaguarem for, in which much of the music from Comte Ory you're going to hear in the Comte Ory this afternoon. He was overthrown by a revolution in 1830, and Rossini was very much connected with the regime of Charles X. So he started to see the shifting times. He started to see the shifting musical aesthetics. Even at the age of 36, Rossini's music was starting to be seen as something that was old school. It was not pushing Italian art forward anymore. So maybe instead of adapting to those times, he decided to kind of quit while he was ahead, if you will. Maybe it was his, we're not exactly sure how much of this is true, but he apparently met with Beethoven, Rossini loved Beethoven, and Beethoven somewhat devastated him when he said, "Oh, you just stick to those fun comic operas, you're good at that." Rossini, who saw himself as a much more serious composer, was pretty devastated that his idol saw him in such kind of blatant commercial terms as that. But as he lived for the subsequent decades of his life, he went back and forth from Italy to Paris and was famous for his glittering salons. He was famous for his wit. He was famous for his kind of joy that he would exude as he was entertaining his guests. He continued to serve as a producer for theaters, moving opera forward, even if it wasn't with his own compositions. He was a champion of people like Donizetti, really fostering that next generation of composers, and famously even met with people like Wagner. You know, he was a part of the musical and cultural world surrounding him, a world that he had helped to build as a young man. He did write several pieces in his older age. He wrote a Stabat Mater after the death of his mother. He wrote a Mass that is also incredibly beautiful and one of his great works that is worth noting as well. So it's a really fascinating life, and it's very easy to, and worth diving into this incredible prolific work that he created as a young man. He wrote 39 operas before he was 36. And then this interesting cultural life that really combines the deeply personal, the psychological, with the cultural and political. Rossini saw much of an incredibly tumultuous century, and there is much to be gained by looking at his life and work through that lens. So we're almost out of time, but I hope that this presentation has given you a little bit of insight into the world of Rossini, into the constantly shifting times, the hustle that he was required to have in order to create these works that are continued to be performed today. Many of his most famous operas, and the Le Comte Ory is included, he wrote very quickly. So imagine spending just a couple of weeks recycling some music, putting your signature stamp on it, and have it be performed centuries after its premiere. Clearly, that is evidence of a genius. You will see the youthful vigor of a young man writing at the beginning of a century, combining French and Italian tastes in this world of the bel canto to bring you this wonderful effervescent comedy, Le Comte Ory. I sincerely hope you enjoy the opera this afternoon. If you have any questions, I'll be moderating the Facebook chat, which will be happening in just about 15 minutes. So in true bel canto fashion, I encourage you to go get lunch to eat while you are enjoying the opera. Go get something to drink, good Italian wine. Rossini definitely would approve of that, and fall in love with the wonderful musical world and our singer-based medium in Le Comte Ory. Thank you so much and enjoy the show.